into it, and let's start off with the 2002 Sam Raimi's Spider-Man.
Of course, something I wanted to talk about with this first Spider-Man movie was a lot of people kind of talk about what was the first comic book movie to really set the stage for the modern era of comic book movies that we have today. I think it was this movie was the first Spider-Man. A lot of people say it was that first X-Men. A lot of people say it was Blade.
Blade's a close one too, yeah.
I'd say X-Men and Blade definitely, they deserve their own merits as of what they did for the way people perceive comic book movies and that they could be made on that big of a scale. But Spider-Man is really what it had the biggest opening weekend of all time when it first came out, and I felt like it definitely was the big one to resonate the most with audiences. Definitely a lot more so than the Blade movies or the X-Men movie that had come out beforehand.
Well, that's what I was going to talk on because of the opening weekend. It really set the stage, I think, for the comic book movies. And really, Sam Raimi had an impossible task, which was how do you take these Spider-Man comics and put them into movie format. Of course, the X-Men did it before, but I think as corny as that first X-Men movie is a little bit, it still was a little more grounded than this first Spider-Man movie. And yeah, that first movie really embraced like the camp of the early comics.
Let's discuss where we want to start with this. We want villains, Spider-Man's a hero, Mary Jane. Where do you want to start with this first film?
I don't know, just talk about what works.
Well, what this movie, for me, what it means to, I mean, I can't remember, I was born in the year 2000, so I really can't remember a time in my life that I didn't have these first two Spider-Man movies. And I just remember it was a movie that I felt like...
Right. Cut from 4:37 to 4:45.
Watching, because I did marathon these movies, and something that I did know, admittedly, this first one, it's corny, it's cheesy, it doesn't hold up as well as other comic movies do, especially from around this time, but much like the first X-Men movie, both of them I think are very similar. They're both very corny and cheesy, but I can forgive it because it was a first of its kind. And really, this movie was very true to the comics of like the 60s.
They tried to be, yeah.
And that's what I was going to say too. I think it took the best elements of ripping stuff straight out of the comic book material while also giving it a mixture of just feeling like this is a real world that like these characters are being put into. And so that was probably another very challenging task that this movie had to pull off, like being able to be taken serious but also stay faithful to a lot of the silly silly and cheesy somewhat source material, even though not to discredit it whatsoever.
Well, you're talking about being faithful to the actual source material, and that's kind of why Sam Raimi was chosen in the first place. They wanted a director who was familiar with the comic books, who knew what he was doing, knew what it should and will look like. And Sam Raimi had all that experience. He's done a lot of comic movies, not before this one, but had a lot of experience reading them, loving to read them.
He did Dark Man, which I think was based off of a comic, but I think I read that he was chosen because he was very familiar with the material, like you said. He had a lot of the Spider-Man comics, but I think it's worth noting the history that this movie had, because they have been trying to make a live-action Spider-Man movie since, I believe, the 80s. I mean, at one point, James Cameron was supposed to make one in the 90s with apparently Leonardo DiCaprio.
That would have been interesting.
Of course, it's never concrete if Leonardo was the consideration for it, but it probably was. It's James Cameron. He did Titanic. I mean,
up until 2002, all you had was the 70s TV show, Spider-Man.
Yeah.
That's it. So this was like a first of its kind.
And I think it's safe to say, even at the time that came out, that wasn't anywhere nearly the phenomenon that Raimi's trilogy was when it hit audiences.
Exactly.
Of course, we have to bring up Willem Dafoe as Green Goblin.
Oh my God, what a hero. I love him.
Well, it's so interesting because Willem Dafoe himself has said that he really fought to get that role. He really wanted it, and he's talked about how people around him were telling him, or were kind of judging that, like, oh, why would you want to do it's a silly comic book movie? But that's what I love about Willem Dafoe, is that he's not one of those actors that thinks he's above a comic book movie or anything. If he loves a role, thinks it's interesting and fun, he'll do it, and I think he killed it. It's the perfect choice, honestly, for the Green Goblin.
Honestly, yeah, Willem Dafoe knocked it out of the park. I mean, I couldn't think of a more iconic villain with Spider-Man, his number one nemesis practically, and then bringing him into the very first movie. Although, in retrospect, it does look, like you said, campy at times and a little comical, with the costuming especially. I mean, it was done fairly well, in my opinion.
There's actually unused footage of what they were originally going to go with that Green Goblin costume, with an actual mask that moved, the mouth moved, and it looked very more comic accurate to like a goblin face.
Yeah.
Which would have been interesting to see. The costume, I love the mask, but the suit itself was very corny.
Yeah, exactly. The suit was corny. Remember he had the Nike air boot, what was it, on his feet? It was
some name brand shoes.
Some name brand shoes. They
sprayed true NYC villain.
They put some just plain ass little arm pieces on top of them, sprayed them neon green, and just put them on him.
But he did all his stunts. He did all his own stunts too. He practiced with a harness on the glider and everything.
Yeah. So why does Tobey work so well? Why do we think he was cast so well?
Well, I think all of us would probably agree that Tobey Maguire is our childhood Spider-Man. He's our favorite Spider-Man, and
of course we're biased.
Yeah, of course.
It's the nostalgia of the whole scenario.
Well, not just that, but I feel like he brought something to the role, and not just his performance, but maybe a little bit more like of the way he was written. This was a guy that you could really feel for. I think everybody has related to a lot of the struggles they went through, whether it came to just aspiring to be with Mary Jane or just having financial issues. It just made him a lot more grounded of a character, and it touched on these really important traits of his character from the comics that the other two iterations of Spider-Man, they had like little moments, but I feel like these really hit home the most in these movies.
But yeah, back on Tobey, I mean, I kind of grow up. There's nothing you can't see yourself within his character. The flaws of being a high school loser, kind of. I mean, he's struggling to get to the bus. He can't get the girl he wants. He doesn't have the car, which is what sets him on that track in the first place.
Of course, we'll see in the next movie his problems really kick in, and I guess we should talk about Mary Jane and like the relationship, which, I gotta be honest, is one of the weaker factors of this trilogy, is the relationship with him and Mary Jane.
Not only the relationship, it's just the lack of development within Mary Jane herself as a character.
I would say for this first movie, I really felt like they did a better job with her character for 2 and 3. Just in my opinion, you can kind of see more of where she's coming from and what she wants. In this movie, she does feel kind of like a plot device.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah. Other great things that I do love about this is the end fight with Spider-Man and Green Goblin when he's just punching him. It is brutal.
Especially for PG-13.
Yes.
It pushes the limits, definitely. I mean, it's like Tom Holland said recently in an interview that one of his favorite things from the original Sam Raimi trilogy was the fact that Tobey's suits always get beaten up and torn up, and they show how he's physically taking a toll. Compared to MCU, they always don't get cut up very much. It's always pretty clean.
True.
Well, I just feel that this is an underrated scene. Not a lot of people talk about that end fight with... and that's what's so interesting, is that this movie, as corny as it is for the most part, the end, it's brutal and raw and like not corny at all.
Oh yeah.
No, it really does show. I mean, it's fun and games when he's Spider-Man, but it shows kind of how serious this is and how much of a toll it can take. I mean, and looking at the way that it ends, where Norman dies and it kind of sets up the guilt that Peter has to go on without telling his friend, who's Harry, who means so much to him, that in a way he was there when his father passed.
Right. I mean, one aspect I like to look at a lot is just that the fight scenes get progressively darker and darker. If you notice in the movie, one, they're jumping around on parade balloons at one point, and it's kind of a little silly in nature, but
It's
we've
fun.
also throwing pumpkin bombs, blowing people up and the skeletons, and then you get to the burning building fight, which is a little more serious, and then you get finally to that on the bridge fight. We choose between the kids and Mary Jane, and suddenly it gets really dark and it's brutal.
And another more serious element of this movie is the arc that I would say Peter has. From the beginning, trying to figure out who he is, and when he goes to, the last thing that he says to Uncle Ben, when he says, "I know I'm not your father," and he says, "Stop pretending to be," and how the movie comes full circle at the end where he is able to become the man that he knows his uncle would be proud of. And he says, "I had a father. His name was Ben Parker."
Right. So we've talked a lot about Spider-Man 1 and just overall thoughts on it. Let's move on to Spider-Man 2 now.
I kind of just wanted to close, the first Spider-Man, overall, I think, as a first effort, doing a Spider-Man, it had never been done before. So I think as a first effort, it was really good. And like we said, biggest opening weekend. So it was very successful. And I don't think anyone really could have expected the amount of success that it had at the time.
And my opinion too, even regardless, first effort or not, I still really enjoy this movie.